boy selling food on the streets to pay for his mother's treatment, when his fugitive father shows up, and the next day, a millionaire knocks on his door, and at just 14 years old, Ethan Miller carried burdens that most adults would struggle to bear. He didn't know what it meant to be carefree. His mornings began long before the city stirred. With slow, practiced motions, he prepared sandwiches, soup, and tea in the cramped kitchen of the small apartment he shared with his mother, Sarah. He moved quietly, careful not to wake her. The medication she relied on to fight her illness left her weak, but they also drained what little money they had. Every day was a battle against time, bills, and exhaustion. As he packed the food into containers, Ethan's mind raced with thoughts of overdue rent notices and the growing cost of his mother's treatments. The responsibilities were crushing, but Ethan couldn't afford to stop. When everything was ready, he dragged his food cart down the narrow staircase of the apartment building and out into the streets, his arms already aching. The city was still in its early hours, but Ethan knew that every second counted. The faster he set up, the better his chance to catch the morning rush of commuters. As he pushed the cart to his usual corner, his face remained blank, hiding the weariness that lived in his bones. If I sell out today, maybe I can buy that extra inhaler Mom needs, he thought. But even when things went well, there was always something else to pay for, another bill, another doctor's appointment. The weight on his young shoulders never lightened. The corner he chose to sell his food was busy, a stream of professionals, students, and tourists. Ethan laid out his sandwiches and soups, adjusting the handwritten sign that offered them for a modest price. His voice was soft but steady as he called out to passers-by. Fresh sandwiches, hot soup, help yourself. Throughout the day, Ethan exchanged brief words with the strangers who bought from him. A businessman with his phone glued to his ear handed over cash without making eye contact. A young woman smiled politely, thanking him before rushing off to catch her train. Ethan noticed these people, their rushed movements, the way they hardly saw him. He was just part of the scenery, a kid trying to make a living among the city's chaos. But he was used to being invisible. "You're a kid," some people would occasionally say when they noticed his age. But Ethan would only shrug in response. What was the point in explaining? His life didn't leave room for childhood. Between transactions, his thoughts drifted back to his father, Richard, the man who had vanished 5 years ago without warning. Ethan could still picture him, standing in the doorway of their apartment, saying he had to leave for just a while. But a while became weeks, months, years, and the silence that followed left an ache too deep to fill. There had been no letters, no phone calls, nothing, just emptiness. His absence gnawed at Ethan's heart in quiet moments, though he rarely allowed himself to dwell on it. If he cared, he would have come back, Ethan thought bitterly. The anger still simmered beneath the surface, even after all this time. But as much as Ethan wanted to bury those feelings, a part of him longed for answers. That night, after the last sandwich was sold and the final coins collected, Ethan folded up his small cart. His fingers were numb from the cold steel of the frame, but he had made enough for the day, just barely. It was late, and the street lights buzzed overhead as he packed his things, the hum of the city now distant in the background. As he crouched to secure the cart, he heard footsteps behind him, slow, deliberate. Ethan stiffened. He was used to the occasional stranger passing by, but something about the rhythm of these steps made his heart race. They were familiar. A voice followed, low and hoarse. "Ethan." The boy froze. His chest tightened, and for a moment he couldn't breathe. That voice! It was impossible. Slowly, he turned around, and there he was. A man, standing just a few feet away, half hidden in the dim light of the street lamp. His hair was longer, his beard unkempt, and his clothes worn. His posture sagged with exhaustion, as if carrying invisible burdens. But those eyes, deep and familiar, locked onto Ethan's with a mixture of guilt and hope. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as recognition hit him like a punch to the gut. "Dad!" The word escaped him, more a whisper than a question. He felt the sting of anger rise immediately after, but disbelief held it back for now. Richard took a hesitant step forward, his voice cautious. "Yeah, it's me." For a moment, they both stood frozen, father and son, staring across a chasm of 5 long years. Ethan's hands clenched into fists at his sides, the weight of abandoned promises and unanswered questions pressing down on him. "You!" Ethan's voice cracked and he swallowed hard, trying to steady himself. "You left us." Richard looked down, his expression heavy with regret. I know I did." He rubbed the back of his neck, as if the words were physically painful to say. "And I'm sorry, son. Ethan cut him off, his voice sharp with the hurt that had festered over the years. "Sorry." He took a step closer, his fist trembling. "You think that's enough? Do you know what it's been like for us? For me?" Richard winced but didn't back away. He deserved every bit of Ethan's anger, and he knew it. "I didn't mean to hurt you," Richard said quietly. I thought I could fix things. I thought if I could just make enough money, things would be better. But things got out of control." Ethan shook his head, his eyes burning with unshed tears. "You left us with nothing. Mom's sick. She's been sick for years, and you weren't there." Richard's shoulders sagged even further under the weight of Ethan's words. He looked like a man drowning in guilt, but Ethan wasn't ready to let him surface just yet. "I know I failed," Richard whispered, "and I'll never forgive myself for that. But, Ethan, I need your help now. Please." Ethan's heart twisted painfully. Part of him wanted to scream at Richard, to tell him to disappear again and never come back. But another part, a small, stubborn part, clung to the hope that maybe, just maybe, this man could offer the answers he had been searching for all these years. "Help," Ethan repeated, his voice filled with disbelief. "You think I can just forgive you and help you?" Richard nodded slowly, desperation flickering in his tired eyes. "There are people after me, Ethan. Bad people. I've been running, but I have nowhere else to go." Ethan crossed his arms tightly, struggling to contain the storm of emotions inside him. Anger, sadness, betrayal. They all swirled together, making it impossible to think clearly. After what felt like an eternity, Ethan exhaled sharply. "Fine, you can stay, but only for tonight." His voice was cold, the words heavy with unspoken conditions. "You sleep in the basement. We'll talk tomorrow." Richard nodded, a flicker of gratitude crossing his face. "Thank you, son." But Ethan didn't respond. He turned on his heel and began walking toward the apartment, the sound of his father's footsteps following him at a cautious distance. As they entered the building, Ethan felt the weight of the moment settle over him, a strange, suffocating mix of resentment and reluctant hope. The man who had abandoned them was back, and though Ethan wasn't sure what would happen next, one thing was certain. Nothing in his life would ever be the same. And with that, the door to the past cracked open, letting old ghosts slip through. Tomorrow would bring questions. Questions Ethan wasn't sure he was ready to ask. The next morning, Ethan stood in the kitchen, focused on the rhythmic task of preparing sandwiches and stirring a pot of soup. Each movement was automatic, his mind already calculating the day's sales and what it could cover: rent, medication, maybe something extra for his mother if he was lucky. He moved quickly, the weight of responsibility pressing down on him like always. A sudden, sharp knock on the apartment door startled him. Ethan paused, wiping his hands on a rag, and glanced toward the entrance. Few people ever visited, and those who did weren't the kind of visitors he wanted. His chest tightened slightly, but he forced himself to approach. Opening the door, Ethan found himself face to face with a tall man dressed in a flawless black suit. His expression was calm but serious, and his eyes, sharp and observant, studied Ethan with unsettling precision. "Good morning," the man greeted, his voice smooth and professional. "Are you Ethan Miller?" Ethan's grip on the door tightened. "Yeah. Who's asking?" The man extended his hand with an air of confidence. "My name is William Anderson. I'd like to discuss an opportunity with you." Ethan stared at the outstretched hand, but didn't take it. His instincts screamed caution. No one ever showed up offering good things out of the blue. People like him, kids scraping by, weren't the kind who received opportunities. "What kind of opportunity?" Ethan asked, keeping his tone guarded. "May I come in?" William asked, glancing briefly down the hallway. Ethan hesitated, torn between suspicion and curiosity. Finally, he stepped aside and let William enter, closing the door behind him. They walked into the small, cluttered living room, where William took a seat on the worn couch without waiting for an invitation. Ethan remained standing, arms crossed, trying to read the man's intentions. "This won't take long," William said, adjusting his posture. "I've been following your work for a while. I've seen you out there on the streets, selling food, working hard to support your mother. That's not something most kids your age have to do." Ethan narrowed his eyes. "So, what do you want?" William's gaze remained steady. "I want to offer you a chance. A scholarship to a private school. Financial support to help with your mother's treatment." Ethan blinked, stunned into silence. A private school? Support for his mom's treatment? It sounded too good. Too good. His whole life, no one had given him anything for free. The offer felt like a trick, like bait dangling in front of a desperate kid. "Why would you do that?" Ethan asked, suspicion lacing his voice. William smiled, but there was a hint of something unreadable in his expression. "Because I believe in helping people who deserve it. And you, Ethan, deserve it." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Ethan's mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. Every instinct told him that nothing came without a catch, but William's calm, measured demeanor didn't give anything away. Ethan shifted his weight from one foot to the other, crossing his arms tighter against his chest. "You don't even know me," he muttered. "How do you know I deserve anything?" William's smile widened slightly, but it wasn't smug. It was almost knowing. "I know enough," he replied. "I know you've been doing more than most adults would ever manage. I know you haven't given up, even when life hasn't been fair to you." He paused, letting the words sink in. "And I know that you could do a lot more with the right support." Ethan swallowed, feeling a strange mix of emotions, hope, doubt, and the aching weight of years spent without help. "What's the catch?" He thought again, but the words wouldn't come out. His hands fidgeted, and he looked away for a moment, overwhelmed by the idea that anyone, might see potential in him. Before he could respond, a loud, sudden thud echoed from the direction of the basement. Ethan stiffened instantly. His pulse quickened, and his heart thumped hard against his ribs. He knew exactly where that sound had come from, and who it was. William's head tilted slightly, his eyes sharpening with curiosity. What was that? Ethan's mind raced. His father was supposed to be hidden, quiet. They were supposed to have time to figure things out before anyone noticed. But now, The noise from the basement threatened to unravel everything. "It's nothing," Ethan said quickly, but his voice came out too tight, too forced. William didn't move from the couch, but Ethan could feel the man's gaze lock onto him, as if dissecting every word, every hesitation. "That didn't sound like nothing," William remarked, his tone casual but firm. Ethan swallowed hard, his stomach twisting in knots. "It's just some stuff in the basement. We had a leak down there. It's no big deal." William gave a slow, deliberate nod, though his eyes remained sharp, as if he didn't believe a word Ethan was saying. For a moment, silence filled the room, thick and heavy, like a storm waiting to break. Then, as if to make things worse, another sound came from the basement. This time, it was the unmistakable scrape of something heavy being moved. Ethan cursed under his breath. "Ethan," William said quietly, his voice suddenly taking on a more serious edge. "Is there someone down there?" Ethan's throat went dry. Panic surged through him, but he forced himself to stay calm. "No," he lied, shaking his head. "It's just old furniture. The place is falling apart." William leaned back slightly, studying Ethan with unnerving patience. "You know," he began, "I've been around long enough to know when someone's hiding something." His tone was calm, almost conversational, but there was an underlying weight to his words, a warning that he wasn't someone easily fooled. Ethan clenched his jaw, feeling the walls closing in around him. Every second stretched painfully, the air thick with tension. Then, just as Ethan thought he might be able to deflect William's attention for good, the basement door swung open with a loud creak. Ethan's heart dropped into his stomach. From the shadows of the basement stairwell, Richard appeared, disheveled, unshaven, and looking every bit like a man on the run. His eyes, wild with fear, locked onto William the moment he stepped into view. William's expression changed instantly. The calm, professional mask slipped away, replaced by something colder, something dangerous. "Richard Miller," William said softly, as if confirming a long-standing suspicion. Ethan's head snapped toward William, confusion and betrayal crashing over him like a tidal wave. You know him?" Ethan stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. William stood slowly, his presence suddenly looming. "I was hoping I wouldn't have to meet him like this," he said, pulling a badge from the inside pocket of his jacket. Ethan stared at the badge, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. "FBI," William said, his voice low and controlled. "We've been tracking your father for months." Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, the room spinning around him. "You used me," he whispered, the betrayal cutting deeper than he thought possible. William met his gaze, and for the first time, there was something almost like regret in his eyes. "We needed to make sure he was here before we moved in." "I'm sorry, Ethan." Ethan's world crumbled in an instant. The offer, the kindness, the chance at a better life. It had all been a lie. He had been a pawn in their game, used to lure his father out of hiding. Before Ethan could react, the front door burst open and several agents stormed in, weapons drawn. "FBI! Hands in the air!" one of them shouted. Richard tried to run, but two agents tackled him to the ground. "No!" Ethan shouted, helpless as he watched his father being pinned and cuffed. Richard struggled briefly, then went still, his face pressed against the floor. He turned his head toward Ethan, his eyes filled with shame and a silent apology. "I'm sorry, kid," Richard whispered hoarsely as the agents dragged him toward the door. Ethan stood frozen, his heart shattered. Everything, his father, the promise of a better future, the fragile hope he'd held on to, was gone in an instant, and all he could do was watch as it slipped through his fingers. The basement door exploded inward. Splinters of wood flying across the room as it was smashed open by force. Ethan flinched, instinctively stepping back as a flood of armed men poured into the apartment, weapons drawn and shouting commands. FBI, get down! Hands where we can see them. The chaos paralyzed Ethan. The room blurred around him, his mind struggling to make sense of what was happening. His heart raced as the agents swarmed toward the basement stairs. "Dad, run!" Ethan shouted, but it was too late. Richard tried to scramble up the last few steps, but two agents tackled him before he could make it. He hit the floor hard with a grunt, his arms yanked behind his back. The metallic click of handcuffs echoed loudly in the small space, making Ethan's stomach churn. "Dad!" Ethan took a step forward, but an agent pointed a stern hand in his direction. "Stay where you are, kid." Ethan froze, his fists clenching helplessly at his sides as his father thrashed against the cuffs. "Don't do this!" Richard barked, his voice filled with panic. He twisted under the agent's grip, but they pinned him to the floor with cold precision. "You can't, Ethan, listen to me." One of the agents yanked Richard to his feet, his face pressed in a grimace of defeat as they held him firmly. Ethan felt a strange sensation, like the floor beneath him was cracking open, pulling everything he knew into an endless pit. The apartment that had always felt too small now seemed suffocating, as if the walls were closing in. "FBI," Ethan muttered, his voice cracking under the weight of disbelief. He turned toward William, his eyes wide with confusion and betrayal. "What the hell is going on?" William, who had remained disturbingly calm throughout the raid, stepped forward with an air of grim acceptance. His face was unreadable, but his posture said everything. He had expected this to happen. Slowly, deliberately, William reached into his jacket and pulled out a badge, holding it up for Ethan to see. "I'm a federal agent, Ethan," William said quietly. "We've been tracking your father for a long time." The words hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. His chest tightened, and he felt like he couldn't breathe. "You're FBI." He took a step back, shaking his head as if the motion alone could make sense of it all. "You knew this whole time?" William gave a short nod, his expression hard to read. "Yes. I needed proof before we could make the arrest." Ethan's stomach twisted painfully, anger rising like bile in the back of his throat. "So you used me?" His voice trembled with a mixture of rage and hurt. "The scholarship, the offer from my mom, all of it was just to get to him." William's eyes softened, but only slightly. "It wasn't like that, Ethan. I didn't want to involve you." "You did involve me," Ethan shouted, the anger finally breaking free. "You sat here in my house, pretending to care, pretending to help me. And all along you were just waiting for him to show up." William opened his mouth to respond, but Ethan didn't give him the chance. "Do you have any idea what this is like? Do you have any idea what it's like to think someone finally wants to help, only to find out it's all a lie?" The raw emotion in Ethan's voice hung in the air, heavy and sharp. William looked down briefly, as if absorbing the weight of Ethan's words. "It wasn't a lie, Ethan," William said softly. "I meant what I said about helping you and your mom. I still do." Ethan let out a bitter laugh, though there was nothing humorous in it. "Right? And I'm just supposed to believe that?" William met his gaze with steady eyes. "Yes," he said firmly, "because no matter what happened today, I still want to help you." Ethan shook his head in disbelief. His entire world felt like it was crumbling, and the one person he had begun to trust was at the center of its collapse. "Why?" Ethan asked, his voice low and full of pain. "Why even pretend to care?" "Because I do care," William answered, his voice calm but sincere. Your father's choices put you and your mother in danger. If we hadn't stopped him, those people he got involved with would have come after both of you. Ethan's jaw clenched. His anger, though still fierce, was slowly giving way to confusion and exhaustion. The world felt too heavy for him to carry, and all he wanted was to wake up from this nightmare. He glanced over at his father, who stood between two agents, his head lowered in shame. Richard hadn't spoken since being dragged from the basement. His shoulders slumped, his eyes fixed on the floor as if he couldn't bear to meet Ethan's gaze. The guilt hung over him like a dark cloud, thick and suffocating. "Say something," Ethan whispered, his voice almost breaking. "Say something, Dad." Richard looked up slowly, his eyes filled with regret. "I'm sorry, kid," he muttered, barely audible. "I thought I could fix things, but I just made everything worse." Ethan stared at him, the anger in his chest battling with the deep, aching sadness that came from years of abandonment. "Why didn't you come back?" Ethan asked, his voice cracking under the weight of the question he had carried for so long. "Why didn't you just stay?" Richard swallowed hard, his throat bobbing with the effort. I thought I could make it right if I just found a way out." He shook his head, defeated. "But there was no way out, Ethan. Not from the people I got involved with." The words didn't feel like enough. Not nearly enough to explain the years of silence, the nights Ethan had spent wondering what he had done wrong. But hearing his father's voice, no matter how broken, stirred something painful inside him, a yearning for the man who had once been his hero, even if only for a short time. An agent tugged at Richard's arm, signaling that it was time to go. Richard glanced at Ethan one last time, his eyes filled with an apology that no words could express. "I'm sorry," Richard whispered again, his voice hoarse. Ethan didn't respond. He couldn't. The lump in his throat made it impossible to speak, and the tears he had been holding back threatened to spill over. All he could do was watch as the agents led his father toward the door, the sound of the handcuffs clinking with each step. As the door swung open, the cold finality of it hit Ethan like a wave. This was real. His father was being taken away, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. William turned to Ethan, his expression unreadable. "I know this is hard," he said quietly, "but this was the only way." Ethan's fists clenched at his sides, his nails digging into his palms. "Just go," he muttered, his voice raw. "Just leave me alone." William hesitated for a moment, as if considering whether to say more. But in the end, he gave a small nod and stepped toward the door. "I'll be in touch," he said softly, before following the other agents out. The apartment fell into a deafening silence. Ethan stood in the middle of the room, his breath shallow, his heart pounding in his chest. Everything felt broken, his trust, his hope, his sense of safety. And now, with his father gone, he was left standing alone in the wreckage. He didn't know what to feel. Anger, sadness, betrayal. Maybe all of it, all at once. And with that, the door clicked shut, leaving Ethan alone with the weight of everything that had just happened. The days that followed felt endless. Ethan shut himself away in his small room, avoiding the world outside as if it no longer existed. His mind was a whirlwind of anger, confusion, and heartbreak, each emotion crashing into the next with relentless force. He lay on the bed, his back to the door, staring at the wall as memories, questions, and regrets played on a loop. He kept replaying the raid. The moment the FBI burst through the basement door, William's cold badge gleaming under the light, and the look on his father's face as the handcuffs clicked shut. The betrayal stung, like a wound that wouldn't stop bleeding. How could they do this to me? Ethan thought over and over. He had been nothing more than a pawn in their game, used by William to catch his father. And Richard, his father, hadn't fought to stay, hadn't even given him a real explanation. He had left Ethan to pick up the shattered pieces, just like before. Each time Ethan thought about it, the anger burned hotter in his chest. He wanted to scream, to punch the walls, to make anyone, feel the same pain that was tearing him apart. But instead, he stayed silent. The weight of it all felt too much to carry, yet he didn't know how to let any of it go. Days passed in a blur. He ignored the knocks on his bedroom door, barely eating, barely moving. When his mom, Sarah, called to him softly from the other side of the door, Ethan couldn't bring himself to answer. He didn't want to talk. Talking meant feeling, and feeling hurt too much. One afternoon, though, the door creaked open slowly. Ethan didn't move as Sarah shuffled inside. Her breathing was labor from the illness that sapped her strength, but she made her way to the edge of his bed and sat down with a small sigh. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice tired but warm. He didn't respond, just kept staring at the wall. She let the silence linger for a moment, her hand resting gently on his arm. "I know it feels like everything's fallen apart," she began softly. "And I wish I could take that pain away, but I can't." Ethan's throat tightened, but he stayed quiet. He hated that she was trying to comfort him when she was the one who needed rest. Yet a part of him couldn't help but feel the warmth in her voice, a tiny light in the overwhelming darkness. Sarah stroked his arm lightly, as if trying to reach him through the layers of hurt. "My love," she continued, "we can't control what other people do, but we can choose how we respond." Ethan squeezed his eyes shut, willing the lump in his throat to go away. Choose how we respond. How could he respond to something like this? His father was gone. William had lied. There was nothing left to fight for. "I know it doesn't feel fair," she whispered. "It never does." Her voice was filled with a sadness that Ethan could feel deep in his bones. She had been through so much herself. Richard's disappearance, her illness, the endless struggle to keep going. And yet here she was, trying to hold him together when she was the one who should have been falling apart. Ethan clenched his fists, the anger bubbling up again. But this time it was mixed with guilt. He hated that she was the one comforting him when she barely had the strength to stand. He wanted to be angry at the whole world, at his father, at William, at himself. But in that moment, all he could feel was the crushing sadness of it all. Sarah leaned down and kissed the top of his head gently. "When you're ready, Ethan," she whispered, "I'll be here." Then, with a soft squeeze of his hand, she stood up slowly and left the room, leaving him alone with his thoughts once more. Ethan lay there in silence, her words echoing in his mind. "We can't control what other people do, but we can choose how we respond." He didn't feel ready to respond to anything. Not yet. A few days later, as Ethan sat on the edge of his bed staring blankly at the floor, a soft thud came from the hallway. Moments later, he heard Sarah's voice from outside his door. "Ethan, sweetheart, there's a letter for you." He didn't answer, but he heard the sound of the envelope sliding under the door. Curiosity flickered faintly through the numbness that had settled over him. Slowly, he reached for the letter and turned it over in his hands. It was addressed to him, the handwriting neat and precise. He ripped open the envelope and unfolded the paper inside, his heart sinking as he recognized the name at the bottom, William Anderson. Ethan's jaw clenched, but his hands didn't let go of the letter. He told himself to toss it aside, to crumple it and never read a word. But something, curiosity, anger, or maybe just a need for closure, kept him holding it. With a shaky breath, he began to read. "Ethan, I know I'm probably the last person you want to hear from right now, and I can't blame you for that. I know how badly I hurt you, and for that, I'm truly sorry. You have every right to be angry with me. I won't try to make excuses for what happened. I lied to you, and I used your trust to get to your father. That's on me. But I need you to understand something. I didn't lie about wanting to help you. That part was real. I still believe in you, Ethan. I still want to help your mom get better, and I still believe you have a future ahead of you, one you deserve. I know it's hard to see that now, and maybe you'll never believe me, but my offer stands. The scholarship, the medical support for your mom. It's all still yours if you want it. I can't undo what's been done, but I want to make this right in any way I can. I'm sorry, Ethan. Truly, William. Ethan read the letter twice, his hands trembling slightly by the time he finished. He sat there for a long time, the letter resting on his lap, his mind spinning with conflicting emotions. Part of him wanted to tear it to shreds and toss it out the window. Another part wanted to march down to wherever William was and throw the words back in his face. But beneath the anger, beneath the betrayal, there was something else, a flicker of something he didn't know how to name. The letter felt sincere, and that only made things worse. Ethan folded the letter carefully and placed it on his nightstand, but he didn't move from the bed. Hours passed as he sat there, the weight of William's words pressing down on him like a stone. He still wants to help, but could Ethan trust that? Could he trust anyone again? The answer didn't come to him that night, or the next, but the letter stayed on his nightstand, untouched but never far from his thoughts. And slowly, very slowly, something began to shift inside him. The anger didn't leave, but it became quieter, no longer drowning out everything else. The sadness stayed too, but it wasn't as sharp, as suffocating. It was just there, like a dull ache that he was learning to live with. For the first time in days, Ethan stood up from the bed. He walked to the window, pressing his forehead against the cool glass as he stared out at the city beyond. The world hadn't stopped, even though his life had felt like it did. Maybe it was time to take one small step forward. Maybe. But for now, he just stood there, the letter from William sitting quietly beside him, waiting. It took Ethan days to gather the courage to visit his father in prison. The thought of seeing Richard again made his stomach twist with conflicting emotions, anger, resentment, sadness, but also something else. He needed answers, but even more than that, he needed to close the door on the past that had haunted him for so long. It wasn't closure he wanted from his father. It was clarity. When Ethan arrived at the prison, the air felt heavy with tension. The guard at the entrance led him through a maze of corridors, the clanging sound of metal doors locking behind them with every step. Ethan's heart pounded louder with each echo. He clenched his fists to keep his hands from shaking. Finally, they arrived at a small room with a plexiglass barrier separating the visitors from the inmates. The guard gestured to a chair, and Ethan sat down, his legs stiff. A few moments later, Richard was escorted in, his wrists cuffed in front of him. Richard looked older than Ethan remembered, as if the years on the run and now behind bars had weighed on him like a heavy chain. His eyes were tired, rimmed with regret, and his shoulders slumped with the burden of guilt. When their gazes met, Richard offered a hesitant, almost apologetic smile. "Hey, kid," Richard said softly, sitting on the other side of the barrier. He picked up the phone attached to the wall so they could speak through the glass. Ethan ignored the greeting and picked up the phone, his grip tight. He didn't have time for small talk. There was only one question on his mind. His voice came out low, sharp, and direct. "Why did you leave us?" Richard's face crumpled slightly, the question hitting him harder than any punch. He exhaled slowly, running a hand over his face, as if trying to smooth out the guilt that had settled there. I thought I was doing the right thing, Richard admitted, his voice rough. I thought, if I could get some quick cash, I could take care of everything, give you and your mom the life you deserved. He paused, struggling to find the right words. But it all went wrong. I made bad decisions, Ethan. Got mixed up with the wrong people. And once I was in, there was no getting out. Ethan sat in silence, his knuckles turning white around the phone. The anger that simmered inside him was hard to contain. But beneath it, he felt a sadness that was even harder to ignore. You thought abandoning us was a way to help. Ethan's voice cracked slightly, and he hated how vulnerable it sounded. You thought leaving us with nothing, no money, no explanation, just nothing, was the right choice? Richard's expression twisted with pain. I know I failed you, both of you. I thought if I stayed, those people would come after us. I was trying to protect you. You didn't protect us, Ethan snapped, cutting him off. You left us alone. Richard closed his eyes for a moment, as if the words physically hurt. I know, he whispered, and I hate myself for it every day. Ethan's heart felt heavy, as though every unsaid word, every unanswered question had settled into his chest, making it hard to breathe. Seeing his father like this, broken, regretful, but still the same man who had chosen to leave, made his emotions even harder to untangle. He wanted to stay angry. It would have been easier that way, but a part of him, small but persistent, wanted to let go of the bitterness that had weighed him down for so long. I needed you, Ethan whispered, the words slipping out before he could stop them. His voice wavered, and for a moment, he hated himself for how small they sounded. We both did. I know, kid, Richard said, tears welling in his eyes. He looked down at the metal table in front of him, his hands clenched into fists. I told myself I'd come back once things were safe. But things just kept getting worse. And then I didn't know how to come back at all. There was silence on both ends of the phone. Ethan felt the familiar ache in his chest, the one he had carried for years, but it was softer now, less sharp. Maybe it wasn't forgiveness. Not yet, but it was something close. Ethan took a deep breath, trying to steady the swirl of emotions inside him. I can't keep carrying this, Dad, he said finally, his voice quiet but firm. I've been angry for so long. At you, at everything. But it's exhausting. I just can't do it anymore. Richard looked up at him, his eyes brimming with tears. I never wanted to hurt you, Ethan. I swear, I thought I was doing the right thing. I just didn't know how badly I was screwing everything up. Ethan swallowed hard, the lump in his throat making it difficult to speak. I forgive you, he whispered, but I need to move on. I can't keep holding on to this. The words felt both heavy and light, as if by saying them, Ethan was releasing the burden that had been dragging him down for so long. Richard nodded slowly, his face crumpling with a mixture of sadness and relief. I understand, he said, his voice thick with emotion. You have no idea how much it means to hear that, Ethan. I don't deserve it, but thank you. Ethan didn't know if he felt lighter or just emptier, but it didn't matter. What mattered was that he was done carrying the anger, the betrayal, the hurt. I have to go, Ethan said, shifting slightly in his seat. He wasn't ready to say goodbye. Not really, but he knew he couldn't stay here any longer. Richard nodded, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. I get it, he whispered. Thank you for coming, kid. I mean that. Ethan gave a small, reluctant nod. Take care of yourself, he said, his voice softer than before. Richard's lips curved into a sad, grateful smile. You too. Ethan slowly hung up the phone, his hand lingering on it for a moment longer than necessary. As he stood, He glanced at his father one last time through the glass. Richard gave him a small, hopeful nod, as if to say that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the end for them. Ethan turned and walked out of the room, each step feeling both heavy and freeing at the same time. For the first time in a long while, the weight on his chest felt lighter. Not gone, but lighter. And that was enough for now. After days of wrestling with indecision, Ethan made his choice. He would accept William's help. He hated how things had started between them, hated the betrayal, the manipulation, the lies. But as much as those feelings still clung to him, he knew the opportunity was too valuable to waste. Sitting alone in the kitchen one evening, staring at the letter from William, Ethan whispered to himself, "It's not about him. It's about Mom and me." He folded the letter carefully, as if the act itself was a commitment, and tucked it into his pocket. That night, he lay awake in bed, his mind turning over the possibilities. For the first time in a long while, the future felt like something real, not just a vague concept too far away to care about. The next morning, Ethan called William. The line rang only once before William answered. "Ethan," William said, his voice warm but cautious. "I wasn't sure if I'd hear from you." Ethan gripped the phone tightly. "I'll take the scholarship," he said, forcing the words out before doubt could creep in, "and the help from my mom. But," he paused, searching for the right way to say it, "we're not friends. Not yet." There was silence on the other end for a beat. Then William's voice came through, calm and understanding. "I get it. Trust takes time." Ethan exhaled slowly, his shoulders easing slightly. "Yeah, it does." Over the next few weeks, things slowly began to change. Ethan started attending the private school that William had arranged for him. It felt surreal at first, walking through halls filled with kids who had no idea what it meant to hustle just to get by, sitting in classrooms with teachers who actually cared if he succeeded. He felt out of place at first, like a fraud, but William checked in regularly, offering advice and guidance without overstepping. He didn't push. He listened, and over time, Ethan found himself beginning to rely on William. Not fully, not yet, but enough to see that maybe, just maybe, this man was different from the others who had let him down. The mentorship started slowly. At first, William would help Ethan with school projects and assignments, giving tips on how to manage his time and think critically. But their conversations gradually drifted beyond academics. They talked about life, about Ethan's fears, his frustrations, his hopes for the future. One evening, as they sat together in a small cafe after one of Ethan's tutoring sessions, William asked a question that had been hanging between them for a while. "Do you still think I used you?" Ethan stirred the coffee in front of him, watching the swirl of cream dissolve into the dark liquid. "I don't know," he admitted honestly. "Part of me still does." But he glanced at William, measuring his words carefully. "You didn't have to keep helping me after everything, but you did." William nodded, his gaze steady. "And I always will, Ethan." No strings attached. That was the moment things began to shift between them. Slowly, cautiously, Ethan allowed William into his life. Not just as a mentor, but as someone he could lean on, someone who didn't walk away when things got hard. At home, things were improving too. With William's financial support, Sarah was finally receiving the care she needed. The color began returning to her face, and the dark circles under her eyes faded. On good days, she would hum softly while making tea, a small smile playing on her lips, something Ethan hadn't seen in years. One afternoon, as they sat on the couch together, she reached over and took Ethan's hand. "You're doing good, sweetheart," she said softly. Ethan smiled, a genuine one this time. So are you, Mom. There was something warm and comforting about those small moments. Simple but meaningful. The kind of moments Ethan had thought he might never experience again. The house, once heavy with silence and fear, felt lighter. There was laughter now, even if it was quiet and rare, but it was real. School became a lifeline for Ethan. With each day, he felt himself growing, not just academically but emotionally. The anger and bitterness he had carried for so long started to shift into something else. Focus. He threw himself into his studies, driven not by obligation but by purpose. For the first time, Ethan began to believe that he had a future, one that didn't have to be defined by his father's mistakes or the weight of the past. The mentorship with William deepened, turning into something more than just academic guidance. William became the steady hand Ethan had never realized he needed, a presence that felt reliable in a way his father never had. There were still moments of hesitation, moments when Ethan questioned whether he could truly trust William. But those moments became fewer as time went on. William's actions spoke louder than any promises ever could. He showed up every time, and that was something Ethan had rarely experienced before. One evening, after finishing a long project for school, Ethan found himself sitting across from William again. This time, the conversation wasn't about grades or assignments. It was about the future. "What do you want to do, Ethan?" William asked. "When all of this is behind you, what's next?" Ethan thought for a moment, tapping his pen against the table. For so long, his only goal had been survival, getting through one day to the next. But now, with his mom recovering and his own future opening up before him, something new stirred inside him. I think Ethan began slowly. "I want to help people. People like me. People who get stuck in bad situations and don't know how to get out." He glanced at William. "Like you helped me." William's smile was small but filled with pride. "That's a good goal, Ethan. A really good one." Ethan nodded, a quiet determination settling in his chest. He didn't know exactly how he was going to make it happen, but for the first time, he believed he could. And that belief, that spark of hope, was something no one could take from him. Years later, Ethan stood on the stage of a packed auditorium, dressed in his graduation gown, looking out at the sea of faces before him. The crowd buzzed with excitement. Families, friends, and classmates sharing in the celebration of a milestone that once had seemed impossible for him. He took a steadying breath, his heart thudding in his chest, not from nerves but from the overwhelming sense of how far he had come. In the front row, his mother sat beaming, her eyes glistening with tears. The vibrant woman she had once been had slowly returned over the years, the weight of illness replaced by hope. Beside her sat William, his face calm and proud, giving Ethan a subtle nod. They had both been there through everything. The lowest points, the hard choices, the moments when Ethan had thought he'd never make it. And now, they were here for this moment too. Ethan approached the microphone, his diploma already tucked under his arm, and scanned the faces in the audience. Many of them didn't know his story, how hard it had been to get here, how close he had come to giving up. But that didn't matter. What mattered was that he knew. This moment wasn't just about the ceremony or the applause. It was about the choice he had made years ago, the choice to keep going, to let go of bitterness, and to transform his pain into something meaningful. He cleared his throat, and the crowd quieted. A calm, steady energy filled him as he began to speak, not from notes, but from the heart. "I've thought a lot about what I wanted to say today," Ethan began, his voice clear and confident. Graduation speeches usually talk about the future, about success, ambition, and making the most of the opportunities ahead. But today, I want to talk about something a little different. The audience leaned in, sensing the weight behind his words. I want to talk about choices, Ethan continued. Not the easy ones. The ones that are obvious, where the path is clear. I want to talk about the choices that define us. The ones we have to make when everything feels impossible. When life throws things at you that you never saw coming. He glanced at his mother and William, drawing strength from their presence. Then he turned back to the audience, his gaze steady. When I was younger, I thought my life was over before it even began, he admitted. I lost people I cared about. I was angry. I thought the world had given up on me, and I almost gave up on myself. He paused for a moment, letting the words settle. But along the way, I learned something important, something I want to share with all of you today. He leaned closer to the microphone, his voice soft but filled with conviction. We are not defined by the circumstances we're born into, or the mistakes we've made, or the people who let us down. We are defined by the choices we make when things are at their hardest. The room was silent, hanging on every word. And the hardest choice I ever made, Ethan continued, his voice steady, was to let go of my anger, to forgive the people who hurt me, and to stop carrying the weight of things I couldn't change. He paused, his throat tightening for just a moment. I chose to take all of that pain and turn it into something I could use, something that would give my life meaning. Ethan scanned the crowd again, seeing some faces nodding in quiet understanding. Pain doesn't have to break us. It can shape us. It can push us to be better, to help others, to make sure no one else feels as lost as we did. He straightened his shoulders and gave a small, genuine smile. And that's the path I've chosen, to take everything I've been through and use it as fuel, to help others find their way, just like people helped me when I needed it most. He glanced at William again, a flicker of emotion passing between them. There had been moments when Ethan wasn't sure if he could ever forgive William for the betrayal. But over time, he realized that William had stayed. Not because he had to, but because he truly cared. And that had made all the difference. We don't always get to choose what happens to us, Ethan said, his voice full of warmth now. But we do get to choose what we do with it. We can carry the weight of anger, or we can set it down and move forward. We can let our past define us, or we can use it to build a future we're proud of. The audience sat in hushed silence for a moment, absorbing his words. Then Ethan gave them a final, quiet smile. So that's my message to all of you today, he said. Whatever you're carrying, whatever you've been through, don't let it be the end of your story. Let it be the beginning. Take your pain and turn it into purpose. There was a beat of stillness, as if the entire room was holding its breath. And then the applause began. Slow at first, then building until the entire auditorium erupted in cheers. Ethan stood at the podium, looking out at the crowd, but the loudest applause was the one inside him, a quiet, steady peace that had taken years to find. It was the sound of finally letting go, of choosing to live fully without the weight of the past dragging him down. He stepped away from the podium and made his way back to his seat. His mother stood to hug him tightly, her hands shaking with emotion. "I'm so proud of you, Ethan," she whispered, tears shining in her eyes. He hugged her back, feeling the warmth of her love seep into every corner of his heart. "Thanks, Mom," he whispered. When he turned toward William, the older man extended a hand. But Ethan shook his head with a small smile and pulled him into a hug instead. William chuckled softly, patting him on the back. "You did good, kid," he said quietly. Ethan pulled back, his smile wide and genuine. "So did you," with his diploma in hand and his heart lighter than it had been in years. Ethan knew that this was only the beginning. There were still challenges ahead, but for the first time, he felt ready to face them. He had made it through the hardest parts of his journey. He had found forgiveness, not just for his father or for William, but for himself. And he had discovered that life wasn't just about surviving. It was about choosing to live fully and freely. As the ceremony ended and the graduates began filing out of the auditorium, Ethan walked with a new sense of purpose. He knew what he wanted to do next, to help others who were lost, just as he had been, to be the kind of person someone could count on. Because, in the end, life wasn't about what had happened to him. It was about what he chose to do with it. And Ethan had chosen to live, not just for himself, but for everyone who still needed to find their way. If you've made it this far, then subscribe to the channel and leave a comment.